thank Brian for that introduction. We were lucky enough to have Brian work with us in Detroit for a while, and you know what a great organizer he is. And it's always a pleasure to come to Wisconsin. Of course, for all of us around the country, we view Wisconsin as a place where the Occupy movement, in many ways, at least within the U.S., got its impetus from the tremendous struggles that took place here. We had people that came down and spent a bunch of time in the Capitol with you all, and we're thrilled by this struggle. So we, in many ways, what you've done here has helped inspire the rest of the country and inspired the struggle that we're seeing now all over the country around the Occupy movement. And of course, we all owe a debt to the sisters and brothers in Tunisia and Egypt who really got it going. So it shows how the working class and the struggles that were affected are worldwide struggles in this period, and we have a lot to learn from each other in terms of how to fight back. Basically, we're fighting the same system, which of course is capitalism that oppresses us all and is responsible for all these crises. I'd like to just begin by saying a couple words about how we got to this foreclosure epidemic that is literally having such devastating consequences for the people all over the country, and there's no sign of abatement. It's an interesting thing. They just announced this big mortgage settlement with the 5 biggest banks, Wells Fargo, Citi, Chase, whichever, Bank of America, and I think it was US Bank, the 5 biggest. But this settlement, if anybody, and I have some good art, I've written articles that describe it, really is, it's less than a joke. It basically, for the 700,000 people, 750,000 people who lost their home, for what's documented now is nothing but criminal fraud by these banks, and we can go into that a little bit more, but that's what this settlement was about. It was a result of their fraud, are going to get $2,000 per person, if they get it, over the next 3 years as payment. $2,000 from losing your home. They billed it as a $25 billion settlement, but that's really a misnomer. The banks really are only going to have to pay $5 billion in this settlement. $3.5 billion of this settlement will go to the states as payment for the tremendous losses in the tax base that the banks have caused. And there's no question, but think about it, they're talking about $3.5 billion when the lost home equity value around the U.S. between 2009 and 2012 as a result of foreclosures amounted to $1.9 trillion. $1.9 trillion. In virtually every city where we talk about all the cutbacks that are going on, I know they're going on here, where we are in Detroit, they're talking about an emergency manager to take over our city, just devastating the social programs. What caused the devastation of the tax base? It was the foreclosures. It was the loss of property value. It was running people out of their homes, destroying our communities. And the thing about it, so here the banks are going to give $3.5 billion as a tiny payment, a pittance for the lost tax base that they caused. But the other thing to think about is, where will that money go? Well, what's a deficit? When a city's in deficit, what's the deficit? It's the payment on debt service to the banks. In Detroit, where I'm from, we have a tremendous deficit. The city pays $600 million in debt service to the banks every year. These are the same banks that have destroyed our communities from foreclosures. They're the ones who collect the money for our tax base. In other words, cut buses so you can pay debt service to the banks. So in essence, this $3.5 billion really is money that's going to go from one pocket into the next pocket. It's money that they're going to pay to the states that is going to be given right back to the banks to pay off the deficits that all these banks are in. And we can talk more about that down the road. There's a $1.5 billion is supposedly earmarked toward, right here. Well, there's about $1.5 billion. The other $1.5 billion is what goes to this $2,000 payment. The rest of the money in this settlement is really supposed to be earmarked for modifications and principal reductions, and they get credit. It's not like they're paying anything. They'll get a credit if they write down principal on a very small number of the loans, because it excludes the bulk of the loans that are actually loans that are where they're getting paid full value by the government, and I'll talk about that in a minute. But even if they were to write down $17 billion in principal, which they're promising to do, there were studies that have just come out that right now there are 11 million homeowners whose homes, the amount that they're paying in their mortgage is above the value of their homes for a total of $750 billion. So just do the math. A $17 billion principal reduction on homes that are $750 billion underwater it's like 1%. It's 1%. So this settlement's a joke. But the most important part of the settlement is they ballyhooed that they're going to enforce more servicing guidelines. I'm an attorney and I do a lot of work in examining the guidelines. The fact is, there's nothing in this settlement that's going to stop one foreclosure. It's simply a repetition of guidelines that are out there that mandate home modification, that mandate a whole slew of programs, but they're programs that are routinely ignored by the banks in every case. Everyone knows people who are losing their homes, who get invited to apply for a modification, they send in the paperwork gets lost. They send it again, it gets lost again. They get put in a trial payment. They're supposed to do 3 trial payments, then get a modification. They do 10 trial modification payments, and then they're in foreclosure. This is repeated over and over again. And these new guidelines that are being announced in the settlement doesn't change anything. It's just a rehash of these same guidelines that are ignored routinely by the banks. And I'll go into why they ignore them so much, but the most important point is no one's enforcing it on behalf of the borrower. Even now, if you call the government and say, well, the banks are ignoring the guidelines, which are your guidelines, there's no one assigned to enforce it on your behalf. If you call the bank, we all know what that takes. You call the bank for years. You go to court, the judges routinely will toss out your case and say there's nothing mandatory about any of these guidelines. And so there's nothing absolutely new in this settlement at all. And in fact, I would contend that it will not stop one of the foreclosures. In fact, most analysts say it's going to speed up foreclosures. Because now that this settlement is out of the way, the banks feel freer to move forward with foreclosures. So for example, last year, there were 2.7 million foreclosure filings across the US, according to Realty Track, which is the real estate agency that kind of monitors foreclosure. They're predicting a big step up in foreclosures. So in fact, this new settlement, in essence, was a cave-in by the attorney generals and by the federal government to the banks, and it's going to free the banks to actually move quicker in taking people's homes. And that's pretty documented by every study. And that's why we shouldn't, so this crisis is not about to abate, it's about to get worse for all of us. And that's why we need to both have a perspective on where the crisis comes from, and also a perspective on what we can do to fight back.